Welcome to the New York Business Leaders Podcast, presented by the Coyle Group. We interview the most interesting and influential business leaders in New York and hear their stories of success, challenges, and lessons learned while building their businesses and personal brands. New episodes drop weekly, so please be sure to subscribe to get updates in your favorite stream. Without further delay, here's your host of the New York Business Leaders Podcast, Gordon Coyle.
Welcome back to the New York Business Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Gordon Coyle. In today's conversation, I get a chance to chat with an old friend, George Bischof. I mentioned during our conversation that we met probably 13 or 14 years ago when I joined the BNI networking chapter that George was a member of, mighty Chapter 12 in New York City. It was a great experience and a great group of people, including George. For years, we'd bump into each other at events in the city and chat, or we'd grab some lunch or breakfast here and there. And today, we're part of another networking group, USA 500, so I get a chance to see George pretty regularly. George is a trust and estates attorney in New York, and in this conversation, we talk about the who, what, when, and where, and how of trust, estates, wills, and planning in general. It's a great conversation for anyone who hasn't done this sort of planning, to give them a sense of why it's needed and how it's done. I think you'll really enjoy George's quick wit and wry sense of humor. George's contact info will appear in the show notes if you want to reach out to him for further conversations. Now, if you have an interesting story that you'd like to tell on this podcast, reach out and let's chat. My email is gbcoyle@thecoylegroup.com. Drop me a line and let's set up a call. I really enjoy hosting this podcast, and I hope you enjoy listening or watching it. I'd also hope that you'll consider joining me in on a conversation one day. Now, without further delay, let's get on to the show. Hey everyone, I'm Gordon Coyle. Welcome back to the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Today, I've got George Bischof with me, an old friend. Geez, we've known each other for 13, 14 years, George?
Sounds about right.
Yeah. So I got into networking in a group that George was a member of, and we've kind of been circling around the networking circles in New York for quite a while, and I enjoy George's company. Interesting character. George, why don't you take a minute or two, introduce yourself and what you do?
Happy to. And that tees up one of my favorite jokes, Gordon, which is to say that my networking persona, which is how you and I know each other, as wills and trust attorney, is almost perfectly congruent to my actual business. So by way of introduction to our listeners, I would say that it's a fairly traditional wills, trust, and estates law practice. We help people with those kinds of documents, which is a little bit of drafting and planning. That's about 70% of it, putting the right documents in place to give shape and form to a plan. And then also, when someone passes, dealing with probate and administration, sometimes I'm representing the executor or trustee, fiduciary in my language, sometimes beneficiary, but helping people navigate the courts and the banks and the process of dealing with a loved one's estate. My office is based in New York City. My office is in Midtown Manhattan. We serve people in the New York metro area. And depending upon whether it's a warm referral from Gordon Coyle, we're not going to go quite as far up as Niagara Falls, but we do have the luxury of serving folks who are a good fit, but we are New York based, serving folks in Lower Connecticut as well. And that's our footprint. And we look to serve folks who want to do good, thoughtful planning with a trusted advisor. So we try to present that image to the world and deliver that service to folks who want to put plans in place.
Great. So that leads me to my first question, and that is, you kind of described what you do. Who are ideal clients for you?
So our ideal clients come in all shapes and sizes. What I would say distinguishes them as a good fit for us is not so much age or family type. We work with folks from, 20-something on up to 90-something, or whether they're single, blended family, married couple, unmarried couple. What I think is a good fit for us in terms of who we can serve well are folks who value professional advice, and they want to invest time and energy into putting a good plan together. Certainly, if we work with clients, they're going to pay us a fee. That's how the world works. But if they're not ready to take some tough decisions and kick around some ideas, then they may not be ready to plan. So one of our core values is encouragement. And once we are engaged with the client, we really do lean into the idea that part of our service delivery is encouraging them to answer the questionnaires, schedule a time to come in. So we're looking for folks who value advice and then want to use that advice to take decisions and put documents in place.
I think that's a great way to look at it, because so many people avoid doing this, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. If they're not ready, it's not a good client. It's not, and you certainly don't want to force somebody into getting this done. You'd like to have a collaborative sort of working relationship with your clients, but you're willing to commit to getting the job done if they're willing to commit to do the job, is what it comes down to.
Exactly right.
And what happens, regardless of their wealth level, what happens to an individual or a family or a couple if they don't do planning and they don't have a will or a trust document in place? What's the downside of not doing this planning work?
Well, we see that in really sort of two different stages or areas, right? The one that's talked about a little bit less, but it really presents some exposure, would be the issue of incapacity, right? So if someone stroke, car accident, and it can happen to the young or the old, let's be clear. If you're not able to make your own decisions for whatever reason, you want to have the documents in place for medical decisions, what in New York we call a healthcare proxy, and for financial legal decisions, what in New York we would call a power of attorney. If you don't have those documents in place, then it's a little bit of a jump ball. If you have a spouse, that your partner, your spouse, will be by law the person who will make those decisions, but not automatically and not immediately. A spouse is often the person with the right to become empowered to do that by becoming appointed as a guardian, or the next person, your adult child, your brother, depending upon your family situation. So far better for incapacity to have those docs in place, right? And then the other one, which we kind of is sort of the headline issue, it's the main event for planning, which is, what happens if I die, right? And, lots of people have walked the earth and died, so it's not an issue of first impression. Most states have a plan that looks a little bit like, if you die and you have no will, half to your spouse, half to your kids. If there's no spouse and no kids, it goes to your parents, actually, which is often not a good answer if your parents are on Medicaid or they're already so rich they're paying estate taxes. If not your parents, then your siblings, nieces, nephews. It's a general next of kin kind of concept, but it leaves very much a jump ball to who's going to do the work of your estate, suing the guy that ran you over, selling your house, collecting your deferred comp, all kinds of work that needs to get done. And without documentation in place, the fallback parameters, the so-called intestate provisions, are not the worst thing, but they're not what you want.
Mm-hmm. And I think we often think that what you do only prepares somebody for when they die. And you bring up a good point that you could become incapacitated for a short period of time or a very long period of time. And decisions need to be made when you can't make them. And there's different varying degrees of somebody's capability or incapabilities or incapacities. And I think that the question mark there is, you don't want to have a question mark, I guess, is really what it comes down to.
Exactly right. Or I'll go you one better, right? Not to turn this into a planning session, but many people don't, or better said, some people have a person in their world that we need to draft around, right? So a single person comes in, well, I want my best friend to be my, healthcare proxy and deal with things if I get run over by a bus. And I say, well, what about your brother? Oh, he's the worst dude in the world. He has addiction issues. I love him, but he could not do this. And I say, well, then we need to put plans in place to let the world know that even if he cleans up okay, not the man for the job. And I speak about that in a way that may seem flip, but I want to be sensitive. If you've got a person in your family who is not a fit to be a guardian, to be an executor, or if you want to leave the money but you want some structure around it, it's hard for people, and being a little light is a way to help people engage in the conversation.
Got it. In our parents' generation, relationships and people got married at a young age, and everybody got married and everybody had kids in somewhat of a traditional sense. Today, traditional doesn't exist in large part. People live together. Same-sex couples live together. There's no legal document or legal marriage between them for long periods of time. How do you address that? And what would you say to a young person who is of some means, and I'm thinking of my own kids, but you're going to, let's say, live with somebody for an extended period of time. It could be 4, 5, 6 years. You may have children with that person. What kind of planning goes on in that situation? And what would you counsel somebody that's like, well, we'll get to it when we get married?
Right. Well, there's a little bit of the 3 small balanced meals a day, plenty of exercise, regular sleep aspect to this, right? If you are committed enough to your partner to build a life together, to build wealth together, to purchase a home, and you choose not to get married, no judgments, right? I mean, I'm deeply committed to the idea that some people like disco, some people like jazz. And I'm a rock and roll guy, although I like both disco and jazz. How you live your life, I'm deeply committed to the idea that that's your choice. But how you protect your partner, how you protect yourself, there's some pretty black and white answers in the law for many of these issues. So, for instance, for people who are cohabiting as unmarried people, even if they're co-parenting or co-owning property, there are some documents you want to put in place so you can protect each other, protect the asset, and protect plans for the children. Depending on any given fact pattern, I can usually come up with a recommended scope of documents and engage in the conversation. What's bad about the law is that there can be unintended consequences for people who are not thoughtful planners. What's good about the law is that most of the time, if you share your objectives and what you want from a round of planning, there's usually a tool in the law to get us there. It wasn't always true 20 years ago, but after some of the court decisions of the mainstream of certain modes of living, it's much easier to find legal protection for the people in your world.
Good advice. Tell us, what does the process of planning and creating a will and going through all this look like? I think a lot of people may have it in their mind, I just can't deal with it. It's just too much. And I think that's part of the hesitation people have with any sort of documentation or admitting to their own potential demise at some point in the future. I haven't sold life insurance for a long time, but I remember people would say, well, we need life insurance. And that's great. Let's fill out an application. And somehow the application never gets completed. So I understand that. But what does the process look like in your world?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I want to sort of share that we have a pretty robust process. And I think that is a differentiating feature for my practice from some. I'm never interested in throwing darts at other advisors, but I am proud of the fact that part of our work is to get people, into the end zone. I always begin with a verbal conversation. What are you trying to do? Tell me about yourself. What are your objectives? Usually around the time we get engaged in a attorney-client relationship and we begin the planning process, I'll send questionnaires. And I say to people quite seriously, do this in 10 minutes, right? The job is to get to first drafts, right? Rounding to the nearest million, what you got. How many ski condos and Volvos you have. How many children you have, and you probably know if you're married or not. And I try to lean into it that way and say, give me the broad brushstrokes. I'm not worried about how many oil and gas units you have in your uncle's family trust. And then say, moving from there, what if you got hit by a bus, who would you want to take care of your children? Who would you want to sell the house? Who should hold your legacy, the money that your children will inherit? Who should hold that as a trustee? That may not be the person that teaches them about tattoos, piercing, driving, and college applications, different skill sets. But for a lot of folks, we try and work the process of questionnaires, but where people get stuck, then it's my job to help them get unstuck very gently. So I'm as much a transaction manager as I am a draftsman.
Got it. So George, I often think about what you do as going from somebody who doesn't have a will or a trust and they need one. So go to George. But during the course of somebody's life, they must have to have this document revised. What are kind of like those inflection points that make the need to go back to George and have this document redone or redrafted or updated?
Yeah, I would answer by saying that a will or trust is doing two main things. It's saying who gets what, all to spouse, downward to kids, and appointing people to do those things, guardian for children, executor. So the trigger for needing to update those documents will usually be when your plans, your choices change, right? People say, well, I just bought a ski condo. Do I have to update my will? And I say, well, if the plan is still all to spouse, down to kids, then your docs are good. If you've bought an asset or inherited something where it doesn't go in according to your plan, you want to make different provisions, let's update the will, right? In terms of appointment of people, if someone is no longer a fit because they've aged out, or God forbid they're no longer with us, or you just have different preferences because the guardians for a 5-year-old are very different sometimes from the guardians for a 15-year-old. So if your personnel, your roster changes, that's an occasion to update your documents.
Okay. Can you differentiate why somebody, so we've got wills and we've got trust. Can you differentiate between the two, why somebody, we know why somebody needs a will. You've kind of covered that because you need a plan, a document to kind of identify what you want done with your assets and how you want things to happen. But what is a trust used for? Who uses trust and why are they used? It's kind of a broad question.
Sure, it is. And it's a broad answer, right? So there are different kinds of trusts, right? There's a trust that gets created when you die, what we call a testamentary trust, and that can be created by a will or a lifetime trust. Classic example there would be a trust for minors, right? So both a will and a lifetime trust can create a trust for your 8-year-old that says, help this kid make it to adulthood. And when they become an adult, they get half at 25, half at 30. So certainly we do a lot of minors trusts. We do trusts for people who are older, not so much Medicaid or elder law planning, but just to protect an asset for their benefit. And we do spousal trusts, right? There are all kinds of good tax reasons to have money going from one partner to another in certain kinds of trusts that can optimize the tax benefits. Those are tools within drafting a plan. In terms of what the plan itself looks like, whether your plan is manifested in a last will and testament only, or it's manifested in what we call a pour over will and a lifetime trust, that's a little question of whether you want to be driving a Chevy or a BMW. Both will do the job. They're both good. One is more robust and flexible than the other. And so, depending on people's scope of their plan, their wealth level, their objectives, we'll sometimes go with a more basic set of planning documents and sometimes a more robust set of planning documents.
Is there a wealth level that kicks somebody from the, basic trust, basic will level to a more sophisticated trust?
It can be a couple different factors, Gordon. Wealth is certainly one of them. As wealth increases and you have greater exposure to and desire to plan around estate taxes, then usually a plan built around a lifetime trust will be a better tool for that. But depending upon your age or issues with your beneficiaries or particular planning objectives, a trust can be a lifetime trust can also be very good. A classic example, unrelated to wealth, is if you're very clear that you want your residence, apartment or house, to go to your child, and you want to sort of make the way clear, having a lifetime trust can be a great way to save some of the hassle and delay on that by doing some of the planning in advance. And all kinds of other examples where a person may want to have the more detailed, more complex plan ahead of time. But to answer your question, certainly wealth is one of them.
And what is today the level of wealth that somebody has to consider the need for a trust for tax purposes?
So in New York, right, we have a federal system, as we know from high school civics, 50 states, one federal government. The federal government has an estate tax, and generally speaking, you can pass up to $12 million to another person without having to pay estate tax on that. It's what we sometimes call the exemption amount. Different states have different exemption amounts. In New York, where I do most of my practice, it's 6 million. Connecticut, it's closer to 12 million. They've tracked the federal. Some states, like Massachusetts, it's surprisingly low. They have $1 million threshold. New Jersey had an estate tax and got rid of it recently. So sometimes there's progress in government. But that's a key question to ask your advisor. What are my estate tax exposures? Which also means, where do you expect to be living down the track, right? Because, that can be a factor. But for most of my clients here in mighty Gotham, $6 million exempt under New York State, 12 million federal. Although 12 million federal is coming down to 6 million in a couple of years. So that's something we're watching.
So you've talked about advisors. Who else is in the pool with you with a client, in an advisory capacity when you're doing these plans typically?
When I'm in the process of drafting, folks come in different modes, right? There are folks who have worked very closely with a financial advisor or who have very strong relationship with their accountant. And there's usually work product or advice there that I will take into account as I do my planning. Other times people say, well, we know we have these objectives for our estate plan, George, can you get that done? And I said, well, there's this other issue. And they say, well, we'll get down to that. And I say, okay. And then in some of the time, certainly people will say, I want you to coordinate with my financial advisor on the right trust structure. And I'm always happy to do that. I do enjoy the chance to work with other advisors who often will have background and insights that I don't have, may know the client much better. So always open to it, but we need to do that less often than you might think.
Okay. So, and that kind of leads me to another question is I would imagine that those other advisors are typically good referral sources for you. Where else do you, what other professionals lead you to business opportunities?
I've only been talking about this for 20 years in my networking world. And here's what I have found. Other folks who are talking to individuals and families about the business of planning. By planning, I mean protecting their assets and each other, is, I think, a don't overthink it question. So people who help individuals and families with their taxes, so accountants to sometimes bookkeepers, people who do financial advisory work, and that can be big wirehouse, let me turn your 6 million into 7 million, or it can be, certified financial planner types who take a more holistic view of things. I like all different kinds of planners. It's the client's job to find the planner, and if they like the fit, they're a fit for me. Other attorneys are a great resource. Not being funny, the guys who are doing airline bankruptcies, not so much. The folks who are talking to people about starting a business, they're real estate attorneys, matrimonial attorneys, people who are touching individuals and families, that's tends to be a richer vein in terms of relationships. And I will share, as you know how the world works, Gordon, I'm often making referrals to those people because, my clients will say, well, yeah, I'll say, do you love your accountant? You really should. Well, not so much. Well, why don't you call one of these three guys. But the so-called trusted advisors are the place I look to build referral relationships and the people whose clients I can help.
Great. You mentioned a little earlier something about elder law. Is that something you do, or is elder law something totally distinct and different from trust and estates law and your practice?
D, all of the above. So the trust and estates law is an area of law named for the substantive practice. We deal with decedents' estates. Elder law, which is a more recent innovation, only 30, 40 years old as a practice area, is named for the clientele, right? And so there are issues where there's some overlap. Any good elder law attorney will do, and well, short answer, I don't do elder law, but there are pieces that any good elder law would do that I also do. So a power of attorney, a healthcare proxy, those kinds of documents, certainly I would work on. But elder law, the one I see most often and can be an urgent and important issue for folks as they age up is Medicaid planning, protecting assets should we all pay into it, and if you need it, you should certainly use it. And if you're going to go into Medicaid, there's some planning you want to do on the front end that will make that go smoothly, and a good elder law person will deal with that. But other issues like suing the nursing home that gave you the bed sores, or suing the building where there's no ramp to get to your job, different kinds of issues that face the elderly. Are typically things that I would refer out to an elder lawyer. I like to know them. We are, I think, partners for much of our planning. Some people do both. I don't. But I always want to have a couple good elder lawyers in different states. It's a very state-by-state practice, in my file.
Got it. Okay. Another thing you mentioned a few minutes ago was probate. So after somebody passes away, I'm not going to answer the question for you. So for the people that are watching or listening, you've already gotten a sense of George's great sense of humor. So that's one of the reasons I love speaking and visiting with George. He's got just a great sense of humor. So tell us, what is probate and why does it exist and how does it work and what does a lawyer need to do, or what does a family need to do when somebody's passing on?
Yeah, no, good question, because it is both simpler than many people realize, but also sometimes very much more complex. The need for probate comes from the state, the Leviathan, the Pharaoh, the king, the IRS, wanting to know who owns what so they can tax it, and also to provide for the orderly administration of capitalism and justice when people pass on. And I don't mean to be, I'm saying that to be a little flip, but when a person passes, the landlord wants to know when they can take the apartment back. The employer wants to know when to pay out the benefit plan. There are assets to collect, bank accounts to be resolved. And so the probate courts are meant to provide a way that can be done with finality and clearly, and to involve the people that need to be involved. It's meant to protect beneficiaries. It's meant to protect the people who passed, the decedents, and other institutions in society. A probate court main job is to take a will and say, well, here's the will of John Q. Public. It seems to have 3 signatures. It's on fine cotton paper. It's signed at the bottom. This looks like a good will. Any objections? And a person might come in and say, well, my father, John Q. Public, had lost his capacity when he made that. It should be rejected. Or, well, this was made with the undue influence of the evil, stepchild. Or, well, there's a later will you didn't know about. So the probate process can be cumbersome, but it's meant to be thorough and it's meant to be final. And when we're talking about interests of beneficiaries, interests of real property, it's important to have a thorough final process. So I'm a fan of probate, and yet at the same time, when people can avoid probate or bypass probate when it's appropriate, I always encourage people to do that too.
And how does somebody bypass probate?
So there are a couple different classic assets. You touch on them all the time that are what we call non-probate assets. And an easy example is a life insurance contract, right? If I say I'm George, and if I die, pay this $100,000 to my sister, the insurance company will do that. That's a valid contract. That money would not need to go through probate. If I own 40 acres of land in Wyoming jointly with my brother that we inherited from my uncle, and it's joint with right of survivorship, if I die first, my brother owns it lock, stock, and barrel with no probate, no need for anything like that. An account designation, if I have a savings account, it says pay on death to my father John, then he shows up with my death certificate and he can collect that money without needing to go through probate. Those are good examples of non-probate assets. And very often for married couples, many assets are owned jointly, particularly the residence. So there are lots of things that bypass probate, which, although it can save time, energy, and money, can also be a tax trap sometimes. And so it's important, even if you get things set up in a non-probate mode, to have that plan reviewed to make sure that it does everything you want it to do.
Okay. So lots of good issues, lots of thoughts kind of circulating in this conversation that maybe people that have not been through a planning process have never considered. And they think that probate is just something that only affects wealthy people or whatever people's preconceived notions are. And I think a lot of people have those around death, dying, taxes, documents, and planning. It's just, so it's an interesting sort of thing to have to educate and deal with. And I'm sure that that's a big piece of your job, is educating clients.
That's exactly right. We have a couple core values, gratitude, service, encouragement, attention, and those all tie into that idea of, helping them get the job done.
So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about your business and marketing your business, because I've seen a noticeable shift in your digital gamemanship. You're upping the game. You've brought on some new folks into the firm, right? In the last 12, 18 months or so?
Well, there's always a bit of transition and turnover, and we've worked hard to manage that well. But we've had some growth as well.
Good.
But I do want to get the word out about, how I work and who's on my team. As charming as I am, we deliver our services through systems, through a team. And, I place a high priority on making sure that my clients and prospective clients know that, we're a firm. And when you sign on with us, you get support from all four of us. Okay,
so you've got 4 people. And one of those folks is a marketing person, right?
Well, I have an outside marketing team that I use, and then I have one person internally who's the principal liaison with them, and also gets the coffee cups ready to go. So it is part of the organization chart internally to sort of make sure I'm smiling.
And tell us a little bit about that marketing. That person, as well as what they do and how you're engaging more and more digitally. I'm loving the content that you're putting out. I think it's really well done.
Well, thank you, Gordon. Praise from Caesar is praise indeed. You've been, your podcast is great. Not a thing I'm doing, but I admire very much and may do. But no, I've it's been a little bit of finding your way forward. I many years ago said, let's do a letter to a client and say, hey, it's been so many years since you did your will, stay in touch. And I did that as a paper letter. That's now an email, and that email has scheduling links, so people want to, call us. So we've gotten more digital in our marketing internally to our existing clients. And then our outward-facing marketing, which is a little bit of, here we are, this is our story, it's who we are. I've done different things over the years. And it's meant to supplement and complement my let's go out and have coffee in our networking group, so that we have something with a little broader reach. The thing that I've had the most fun with, you may be mindful of, is when COVID began almost 2 years ago to the day, I was able to draft at home. I have a computer, I had some paper, I had a printer, I said, we are open for business. So I did a little kind of 60-second video, which I put on Facebook and LinkedIn, and said, hey, I'm George. I'm open for business. If you need a will, you're probably at home, right? You got nothing to do. Do your will, right? I'm open. Here I am drinking a cup of coffee. And people liked it. It was meant to be authentic without being too homespun. It's not an episode of Hee Haw. But we did a couple of those, and it was a good way for me to kind of share a thought or a topic, share what coffee cup I'm using that day. And the response to that was pretty good. And then as I worked with an outside team on issues like that, they said, well, George, let's build on that, because it is a chance for people to see who you are, your manner, and get a sense of what it's like to talk to you. Because what I'm doing ultimately is talking to people. And if I can give a little flavor of what it's like to have a conversation with George, that can help people get started with the planning.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, it's not necessarily Seinfeld, coffee, and cars in conversation, but it's close. So I'll tell you a quick story. I had a call or an email. I booked a call on my appointment on Friday with a guy who had seen one of my videos on YouTube in relation to a unique insurance product. And one of the things that he said hit me was like, I feel like I already know you. And I've had that many times because video has this power of authenticity and trust that is conveyed so much more, I don't even know what the word is, genuinely, more impactfully than the written word. So I've heard that a couple of times from people who have said, oh, I saw you on YouTube and I feel like I already know you, like they want to do business.
Right.
With you. So I think it's a very interesting, cool thing that we're experiencing. So we've been on for a while. I don't want to, I want to be respectful of your time and everybody who's watching or listening. What else do you want to cover, or did we miss anything that you'd like to kind of put in there?
Thank you for asking. One idea, maybe two, I will share for listeners is that, most people do not have a will, and that's very naughty, but it's also very human. And so I'm good with that. When people come in and they say, hey, we've been meaning to do a will, we were going to do it when we had the first kid, and now we've had the second kid, like, oh, we're terrible people, we should have done this. I say two things. One, don't beat yourself up. You're in good company. Most people who are starting a family, building wealth, they're busy. It's okay that you haven't done this. But two, get it done. And so I try to say to them, let's start from where you are now. Let's think about where you want to be, and let's get you there. That's one thing I would take away. For folks who are ready to pick up the phone and schedule a meeting with a planner, there's a little bit of work. You have to sort of lean into it to do it well. But it's not as hard or as long as you think it's going to be. Almost without exception, when I come out of the conference room after wills are signed, people say, George, thank you. We wanted to do this. We should have started sooner, but you made the process go smoothly. We're so glad we did it. And I said, well, you're entitled to that exhale because you did good planning, and pat on the back.
I think that's probably the reaction most people would have, is like it's a big sigh of relief. I took care, big check mark off of my adulting list.
Yeah, and I say to them straight up, I'm like, now you should take your partner to lunch, go out and spend some time together. You did a good thing together.
You did a good thing today. So George, one item that we didn't talk about are costs. Typically, what does a visit with a professional like you cost a customer?
Lawyers answer, it depends. Before I'd say anything about the cost number, I'll share that most of the planning work I do, we do on a flat fee basis. And that's attractive to people. They get a sense of, what it's going to cost, how long it will take. And that's, I think, something most people, I can charge by the hour, and sometimes it's appropriate. But for most of my planning packages, once we agree on the scope of work, I charge a flat fee. The fees are kind of built around a benchmark, and we adjust up and down. So if I have a married couple and they're coming in with minor children, they want to name guardians of those children, plan for each other, a set of wills, healthcare proxies, powers of attorney, living wills, 5 documents each, is about $4,000. If they're warmly referred by Gordon Coyle, we take that down a bit. If we have a non-U.S. spouse and an angry mother-in-law and, a semi-gentrified meth lab and, sort of downtown Greenwich, we'll have to modify that price. But that's a benchmark. If we do an insurance trust, that's a little more. For people who are unmarried, if we're doing a planning for just one person, it's less than that. But that's sort of a high touch Manhattan attorney. You get a great set of docs for a flat fee, about where the market is.
Okay. I think that's good to know, because I think that's always a question mark in somebody's mind. Like, can I afford this? And they're embarrassed to ask. So yeah, I'm glad we put that on the table.
Yeah. And it's client by client, obviously, but I try to be very transparent about that. You can't do this well unless you want to do it, and you're not going to want to do it unless you're comfortable with the price you're paying. So I don't know if I said it exactly this way earlier in the call, but for people who value advice and are willing to pay for that advice, that's a great fit. So I try to get that question out there early so that we can all be on the same page and then get on to the work of planning and drafting.
Great. George, if somebody who's watching or listening to this, they wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
So email works well. I'll reply with some kind of basic stuff. My email is george@bischoflegal.com. That's BISCHOFLEGAL.com. My number is 212-867-9120. And my website is bischoflegal.com. Like the email. Those are great points of entry. And if you want to grab me by the lapel in the elevator, I've had people do that too. No, we try to be reachable. We try to be visible. So I appreciate your asking about that.
Yep, and I'll be sure to put that in the show notes as well. So if somebody's driving or they're on the treadmill at the moment they're listening to this, they have the info. George, it's been great having you on the show. I really appreciate you spending the time with us and talking about wills and trusts and probate and estate language and everything else, and giving us some great ideas. So thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity and for great questions that helped me share my story. I really enjoyed being with you.
Great. And sharing stories is what it's all about. If you've got a good story that you'd like to tell on this podcast, please contact me. My name is Gordon Coyle. My email and contact info will also be in the show notes. And until next time, stay well.
That's it for this week's episode of the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. In the meantime, find more interviews and resources at nybusinessleaders.com.